Hi there, hope you're well. In this week's video, we're going to be talking about clamps and clamping. So yeah, clamps, you can never have too many. Good talk. No, this video came out as a result of my, the 10 tools I wish I had when I started from a few weeks back. I quipped during that I could probably do a whole video about clamps, and the response was quite favourable. And the more I thought about it, the more I felt I had to say about it, because, you know, so often, if you look at the ads for clamps, they're all about malleable, ductile cast iron that's capable of, 5,000 newtons of clamping force, and you can hand them down to your great-grandchildren. And the more I thought about that, the less that was actually relevant to me. If you want that kind of thing, then by all means spend your hard-earned money on that. But I've got well over 100 clamps. I know it's never enough, but the vast majority of them are very cheap. The most expensive ones I've got are some 50 quid parallel jaw clamps that I bought because they were on a deal, to be perfectly honest. But most of the time, most of my work has been held together with this kind of clamp, very cheap and cheerful aluminium Sash clamp. There's no maker's mark on this, shocker. If it's not Silverline or Richmond or one of those sort of budget brands, no offence to those brands, you understand? It's something similar. And I know there are people shouting, you buy cheap, you buy twice. The truth is, I bought 4 of each of these in 600, 900 and 1200 mil, and a pair at 1500. Getting on for 20 years ago, these have clamped up an awful lot of work, many thousands of pounds worth of work. And I think during that time, I've broken one of them. And those 12, 14 clamps cost me a lot less than a single pair of those expensive parallel jaw clamps. So I think we can sort of lose sight of the fact that clamps are sometimes not an end in themselves. They're a means to an end. All I really want from a clamp, and I've always been fairly pragmatic about this, is I want a clamp to hold something down or hold something in place while I perform some other process, whether that's drilling a hole or driving a nail or putting a screw in or routing or cutting a domino slot, or maybe just clamping up a carcass like this one while the glue dries. All I really want is for it to exert enough pressure to keep that in place. 5,000 newtons of pressure, by the way, is 500 kilos. Put 500 kilos across that and it would probably snap in half. Now, I'm sure there are some people who do need that, and I'm equally sure I'm not one of them. I don't know if you're one of them, but have a little think about the kind of work that you do. And in the meantime, let's talk about the clamps that I've been using for the last 20 years. So let's start with the super simple spring clamp, as cheap and cheerful as you get. If you buy enough of them, you can get them for £1 or so a piece. Very simple, sort of glorified bulldog clip, really. Just 2 jaws that pivot around a central spring, which brings the ends together. As those ends meet, because they're only pivoting around a central point, they tend not to meet dead on every time. And because the jaw capacity in these in particular is only 50 mil or so, a couple of inches, what can happen is when you're using it to do a fairly sort of simple little add-on glue batten like this, when the jaws come together, that can sometimes get a little bit swimmy when you've got a film of glue in there as well. So if you don't want to pin this through, what I would suggest is that you try clamping the ends down first with a slightly more robust clamp, and then you can fill in the middle bits with these and then replace the ones at the end. And the other thing you can do with these is to add a little bit of my favourite bicycle inner tube over the jaws, just so that it sort of sits within there. And then if you're putting a moulding or an edging onto a piece like this, you can actually use this as an edge clamp, like so. Run a string of those along to keep it nice and tidy and no pinholes in the moulding. So next up, it's our cheap and cheerful little Sash clamps. Sash clamps come in many different types and all kinds of different sizes, of course, but they all follow a broadly similar pattern. You have a body or a bar and two heads, one of which is fixed, which has the screw clamp mechanism on it, which provides the clamping force, and the other head is variable and locks into place. That lets you quickly adapt to the size of the workpiece. These ones are notorious for being a little bit delicate, a little bit fragile. As I say, in 20 years I've managed to break one of these, but one of the things that will happen is when you put it over your workpiece like this and start applying pressure, especially on a longer clamp, the bar will actually start to bow because the pressure of the clamp, physics being physics, it kind of pulls it in together. And on a carcass like this, that bowing can actually push the top of your carcass out of position. One way around that I found worked quite well was just to put a couple of 6mm packers in, and then when you started to apply pressure, just take them out. Then if a clamp does bow, it doesn't affect your carcass. You can strengthen these up by putting a bar, a wooden batten down the inside of this, but I found that just adding a couple of little packers mitigated that problem altogether. Sash clamps are, I think, unique in clamps in that when you buy one of these, the size quoted refers to the size of the bar of the body, not the clamping capacity. So if you buy a 600mm clamp, the actual clamping capacity is going to be more like around 500, 510mm, something like that. So if you're clamping up 600mm carcasses, best to go for a 900mm set of clamps. So one-handed or quick grip style clamps next. This is the classic sort of solo clamp, an early version of those one-handed clamps. It's got more in common with the sort of classic G-clamp, to be honest, and that was quite quickly superseded by the quick grip style. Again, similar sort of pattern, a fixed head and a movable head, but one that could be moved very easily between the two, and just a squeeze of the trigger, slightly noisy squeeze of this trigger, to bring the two heads together. They don't clamp particularly strongly, these ones, but they were quick and easy to use. And the other party trick that they had was that you could take one of the heads off, reverse it on the bar, and then you turn your quick grip clamp into a spreader, which is quite handy. Now, one of the clamps that I use the most here in the workshop is a version of that. That's the Bessie Duo clamp. Again, similar sort of pattern, a fixed head on a bar and a movable head and a quick squeeze of the trigger to bring them together. These do apply quite a lot of clamping pressure, and the real party trick of this one is that to turn it from a clamp to a spreader is just a question of flicking the dial here, and then that will spread the other way. I use these in the Cabinetry Basics series and in many other cabinet fitting jobs, just on a countertop to bring a cabinet up to the correct height. Very useful for that kind of thing, and really, really handy just to be able to flick a switch to go from clamping to spreading. F-clamps next, and like the one-handed clamps, we've got a fixed head on a bar and a movable head. You actually need to start exerting some clamping pressure to fix that head in place, but it works very well and it will apply a great deal of pressure. You need to be a little bit cautious with these because all that pressure comes through a relatively small head, both on the screw side and on the main side, and although they're covered by little plastic covers, these are notorious for coming adrift. So if you do use these on anything with any kind of a delicate surface, it's always worth putting a little cover packer in there just to protect the surface, because they will apply an awful lot of pressure. These come in a variety of different sizes. This one's a 300, this one is a 900. On the larger ones, again, just like the Sash clamps, there's a tendency for the bar to bow, but because the jaws are so much bigger on these F clamps, that's less of an issue. And finally, let's take a quick look at parallel jaw clamps. Parallel jaw clamps are a development of the regular F-clamp with a fixed and movable head on a bar. They're screw clamps, so capable of very high clamping pressure, but the large flat heads spread that pressure evenly, so there's almost no chance of you damaging your workpiece. The design of the heads makes them very good for sitting flat on a bench, so you can stack the work between the jaws, and it makes them excellent for clamping up things like staves for a chopping board, for example, which is what I've used these ones for. The only other time I've actually used them was when I needed to pull together some janky old sawn timber for a little project that I was doing for the caretaker here in the building. For everything else, the general carcass and cabinetry work that I do, or certainly that I've done, I've just found them too big and too heavy and too cumbersome, and maybe that's just me and what I'm used to. But I said at the start of the video that I was always fairly pragmatic about clamps. I would honestly much rather have a dozen cheap clamps of different sizes and types than a single pair of these for the same kind of money, because I know that I can do far more work with those cheap clamps and work around their limitations for the kind of work that I do. Now, your work may well be different, of course, and I guess the whole point of this video has been to help you think about your own clamping requirements and needs, and just to be a little bit wary of getting caught up in the whole thousands of newtons of clamping pressure and ductile cast iron thing, when actually all you really want and all you really need is to hold something together while the glue dries. Remember as well that clamps are just a means to an end, not an end in themselves. Every stick of furniture that I've ever made for money was held together at some point by a cheap spring clamp, an aluminium sash clamp, a £10 F clamp, or a quick clamp. And while they're not the only clamps that you'll ever need, those 4 or 5 clamp types will take you a long way. I'll leave it there for this one though. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe for more regular workshop videos, and thanks as always to my Patreon and YouTube members whose support makes these videos possible. But I'll call this one done. Thanks so much for taking a look, and I'll see you next time.